Thank you so much for hosting me remotely.
Thank
Uh,
you.
and what we're doing today is talking a bit about Earth Day and a little bit about how we can rethink our food on Earth Day. And it's a really challenging time to be having this conversation, right? Because Earth Day is presumably a time for us to celebrate our Earth and our shared environment. But we're in this period of incredible, intense anxiety and with an uncertain future. And not only are we uncertain about, the the conditions in which we exist every day, but we have this looming climate anxiety as well. And so today, what I want to offer is a conversation about our food system that can inspire some positive change and think about how we can intervene with our food system and what's on our plates to have a bit of more of a positive impact on our shared environment and to prevent situations like this from happening in the future. So I'm going to go ahead and break this down into three parts and just invite you to, an open conversation, and we can just talk about any of the content on any of these slides. And the first part I want to talk about is this connection between food and the environment with a particular focus on climate change. And second, I want to talk about what that has to do with diseases like this and the potential for more diseases like this to happen in the future, unfortunately, and the way that our food system, the role that our food system can play in potentially preventing things like this from breaking out in the future. And third, I want to talk about, to give more of a positive spin on all of this, potential solutions for New Yorkers to think about making better changes in our city and beyond to affect our global community. So first, focusing on this issue of food and the environment, Eric, I know an issue that's close to you and close to a lot of New Yorkers is thinking about our food waste and really having action plans to deal with our food waste and not to be wasting so much of it, because Americans waste more than a third of our food every day. That is individuals and restaurants and grocery stores. But as it turns out, there's another part of food waste that many of us aren't talking about, which is the edible food that we feed to farmed animals every day. And it's a ton of it. It's actually 44% of the edible food that we grow in the world is fed to animals. Why are we using so many resources to feed animals? Well, it turns out, just like us, not all of the food that we eat ends up making us grow. A lot of it is just existing and walking around, sweating, breathing. A lot of these things take energy and they take calories. And that's the case with farm animals as well. So much so that it takes 9 calories of grain just to produce 1 calorie of chicken, with the rest of that being lost to things like body heat and bodily wastes. And because we feed so much of the food that we grow to animals, a large amount of the land that we have in the United States is used just to produce feed and pasture and grasses for animals to eat. Here in this giant rectangle in the center of the country is all of the range and grass that we grow to feed cattle, as well as right next to that, this large chunk of the country that we use just to produce feed to feed animals and to export that feed to other countries, with just a smaller fraction of that land producing all of the other food that we eat. And another thing that happens to those wastes is that they turn into greenhouse gases. And as we know, these greenhouse gases are what is contributing to climate change. 15% of all the greenhouse gases in the world that contribute to climate change come from animal agriculture. And there are a few different estimates of this number because the amount of animals change and the amount of other greenhouse gases like fossil fuels change, but it's always somewhere around this amount.
Is it the largest?
It is not the largest. The largest globally is producing energy. It's burning fossil fuels to produce electricity. But another sector that, globally that is incredibly significant is the transportation sector. And this is on par with, if not slightly greater than, all of the cars, trains, buses, and ships and planes on the earth combined. So, and another thing that's important about this number is that, we can, even in an ideal scenario, if we seriously decreased and nearly eliminated all of the fossil fuels that we're burning in order to produce energy, that still wouldn't get us all the way we need to go in terms of a quote unquote safe amount of global warming, only 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius of warming. We can't cross that finish line if we don't also address animal agriculture. So in terms of breaking down what these greenhouse gases are, it's not only carbon dioxide, which is the greenhouse gas that comes from burning fossil fuels to produce our electricity and drive our cars. Carbon dioxide is a part of it though. It's also, as I show on the left here, the left side of this chart, it's methane and nitrous oxide. These are other powerful greenhouse gases that come largely from agriculture. And on the right side of this chart, I have different sources in agricultural production and in food and supply chains where these different greenhouse gases come from, with the most prominent source of each one of these greenhouse gases being at the top of those lists in bold red. So as you can see, the biggest source of carbon dioxide from our food system is deforestation, clearing land out in order to produce more. And I'll say more about this in another slide. And the biggest source of methane is belches, predominantly from cattle. And the biggest source of nitrous oxide is all of the manure production from farmed animals. And what's interesting about this is way at the bottom of that list of sources of carbon dioxide in our food system is transportation. And a lot of folks are really concerned with reducing food miles and eating more locally. And while it's incredibly important to eat locally for the sake of your local economy and putting dollars more back in the hands of regional farmers to support those livelihoods and be growing more crops, local food doesn't actually make a difference in terms of climate change. What matters far more is what you eat rather than where it comes from.
Very interesting. Tell me, I'm a little, help me understand here. On the left side, these are the types of greenhouse gases?
That's right. So
okay.
All 3 of these things contribute to global warming, and all 3 of them come from agriculture.
Okay, because often when we hear the conversation of greenhouse gases, we sort of think of just one. And I'm learning for the first time, there's more than just one.
Yeah, that's right. And you know, each one contributes differently to global warming. And far and away, the biggest contributor globally is carbon dioxide, which is the predominant one that comes from fossil fuels.
Mm-hmm.
But methane and nitrous oxide also come from agriculture, as well as some coming from fossil fuels in smaller amounts.
Mm-hmm.
Which is why we often hear about cow farts. It turns out it's not farts, it's burps. And that's actually a big source of global greenhouse gases. 20% of our global emissions, when you adjust for the amount that they warm, 20% of our global emissions come from methane.
Wow.
Yeah. With agriculture being the predominant set of sources of that methane, as well as to a lesser extent, natural gas. So all of these things are coming from the food system. And when you add them up, they end up being so significant that the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning to take, our grapes halfway across the country or to ship oranges up from Florida just end up being a very small drip in that overall bucket. So, when we talk about carbon dioxide, as I mentioned, some of it comes from transportation, but the vast majority from the food system comes from the fact that we have to clear more land. And as we also mentioned, a lot of that land use comes from the land footprint that animal agriculture needs in order to produce all of those calories to fatten up animals. So much so that when we hear about the deforestation of the Amazon, 90% of that Amazon deforestation, or according to Manga Bay, the nonprofit, is for the sake of clearing more pasture to raise cattle and to produce animal feed in the form of soy and corn. So, while we often think of logging being the main contributor and mining to the deforestation of the Amazon, it turns out the vast majority of it has to do with animal agriculture. And of course, every time an acre is cleared and burned and the twigs and the leaves and the trunks rot in the field, they produce even more carbon dioxide that would otherwise be locked up in that forest. So as we mentioned, agriculture is a big source not only of the carbon dioxide, but things like nitrous oxide and methane. And the predominant sources of those greenhouse gases, those non-carbon dioxide greenhouse gases, are animal agriculture. So we have this ability to cut out the vast majority of those greenhouse gases by eating lower on the food chain and eating more plant-based. But that's not the only opportunity we actually have to reverse global warming when we eat better, you see, because when we eat differently, not only do we shrink our land footprint, but we provide more opportunity for native ecosystems, including forests, like right here in our own state of New York, to grow back on all of that otherwise needed agricultural land. And what happens when forests grow back on that land is they lock even more CO2 up in their limbs. So what my colleagues and I were actually able to show in a study that we're working on getting published right now is that if Americans eated towards eating largely plant-based diets and reduce their meat to only a couple servings a week, this country could offset more than 7 of the past years of fossil fuel burning combined by locking that carbon away in forests that could grow back on agricultural land that otherwise wouldn't be needed. And another thing that I really hear often about when we talk about animal agriculture's footprint is the fact that cows contribute disproportionately through their belches and their large land requirements to that global change problem. And a big thing that I hear a lot about is how we should be switching from from beef over to chicken. But the problem with doing that is it merely shifts the problem from our land and our atmosphere to the waterways, you see, because chickens actually produce more phosphorus in their manure than cows do. And the problem with phosphorus is that it pollutes water in a really concentrated way. So we have these chicken farms all over the country that are producing massive amounts of phosphorus-laden manure and offloading that into rivers shown here in the second picture. What happens is those rivers wash into major rivers like the Mississippi watershed that get washed into the Gulf of Mexico and produce these massive toxic algal outbreaks that kills fish. As just one example of some of the water pollution that's happening. And the nonprofit Mighty Earth back in 2017 did an analysis of all of the pollution going into the Mississippi River watershed, and they found that the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico, where a lot of fish were being killed in 2017, the biggest contributor to that across the Mississippi watershed was Tyson's, the meat company, who predominantly produces chicken. You know, I'm mentioning chicken as an additional environmental problem on top of the massive amounts of beef and pork that we eat in this country. And that's important not only for water pollution and climate change, but also another major issue that a lot of us are thinking a lot about lately, which is disease. Because these chickens aren't just out in open fields, they're being crammed into sheds where they have, in some cases, not even enough room to spread their wings because they're so close to one another, in communities, in sheds of up to 100,000 chickens each. The US, in order to produce all of the chicken that we eat, raises about 9 billion chickens per year, which is in comparison to, I think it's about 30 million beef cattle a year. And the amount of chickens that we're producing crammed into these environments, we're producing environments that bacteria and viruses, disease pathogens, are able to proliferate. And what's happening in these chicken sheds, in order to slow down the proliferation of that disease, for the bacteria that could potentially exist there, we're constantly feeding them antibiotics to prevent breakouts and to fatten up the chickens up that much more slowly. But, you know, as you or anyone who's been to the doctor know, the doctor, when we go to the doctor's not going to prescribe us antibiotics just because we're worried about possibly getting sick. We have to already be sick and get that antibiotic prescription in order to fight, you know, the strep throat or whatever it is that we already have. We don't want to be taking too much antibiotics as humans, right? Because if those antibiotics kill a lot of the germs shown here in this chart that, you know, might be strep throat, and a couple of those germs live because they might have some type of defense mechanism to that antibiotic, then after we've killed all those blue germs, the orange resistant ones here are going to have the ability to fight off that drug and no longer be susceptible to that antibiotic. And now instead of having a bunch of bacteria we can kill with the drugs we have a bunch of bacteria that we can't kill. This is why our doctors are so hesitant to avoid us more antibiotics than we already need, because taking fewer antibiotics means that they're more effective, and taking more means they don't work as well. And while humans are already being overprescribed antibiotics, the vast majority of antibiotics we use are actually used in the food system for animals, for fattening them up more quickly and for trying to prevent disease before they occur. So this is really the lion's share of the problem. More than 80% of the antibiotics used in this country are for producing meat and dairy. In addition, coronaviruses are known to come from animals, including quite possibly the one that New York City is tragically dealing with right now. What we absolutely know was that the first SARS-CoV outbreak, the SARS outbreak of 2003, actually originated from a bat and was transferred via a wildlife market somewhere in South China to these civet cats that are also traded in these open air markets. And you know, it's not just that it hopped over from one individual animal to another. A lot of these animals are traded in these markets in confined cages. And that is very likely where that first SARS outbreak back in 2003 happened. And it's quite possible that in a similar environment where multiple animals were stacked on top of one another, that's where our current outbreak originated. So, you know, another reason why this is an issue is that, you know, South China is not the only place that is keeping animals confined in very enclosed spaces with the ability to transfer pathogens to one another. We do this all over the country for 9 billion chickens a year right here in our own country. And I was recently watching a fantastic documentary on PBS Frontline about these issues with confining animals and using antibiotics. And right here on the left is the journalist with a veterinarian walking through one of these intensive chicken farms where they're, you know, enclosed and inside of a shed and practically breathing down each other's necks. And they were taking all of these precautions to avoid getting anything from the birds or transferring anything over from themselves to the birds. So they were in these full smocks that zipped up over their suits and put on gloves and put on plastic slippers and hair nets. And, you know, I think we can even see out of all of these precautions, the limitations of this, right? New Yorkers are taking far more precaution than that to prevent transferring a potentially deadly virus to one another. These guys don't have anything over their faces. They could easily accidentally cough and, you know, get germs from the chickens. They're even walking right now in chicken feces. And even after all of these precautions, the woman here on the right, who's a farm worker at the same farm, wasn't taking any of those precautions.
Yeah, I see that.
Yeah, and she's really just wearing a pair of rubber boots and literally picking up dead chicken bodies with a pooper scooper and emptying them into a bucket. So it's really a big issue, because when we've heard of the bird flu, you know, a few years ago and again back in 2009, and we've heard of other bird flus breaking out, these types of environments are where they tend to originate. And all of the most deadly flus that humans get, the so-called influenza A viruses that send thousands of Americans to the hospital every year, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, some in some of the worst years. Actually, those worst forms of the flu are known to originate from chickens.
Wow, wow. I hope you don't mind. I'm eating a whole food plant-based meal as we talk.
Yeah, I think that's exactly the type of precaution that you might need to be taking these days, Eric. So you know, we really can't be careful enough, I think, and especially when we consider that the last major pandemic that the United States had known was the 1918 flu, which is thought to have originated from a chicken farm in Kansas.
Wow, wow.
And when we talk about the bird flu and coronaviruses and how they're researching these things to prevent future outbreaks from happening, we hear about them happening in these class 4 biosecurity labs where everything is vacuum sealed and their outfits are sanitized triply, and there are all these different safety protocols to make sure that a breakout doesn't happen. This is real biosecurity, not the type of biosecurity that farms today are purported to have, where they get into those smocks. The way that we treat birds and other animals on the farm today is way more like bird flu Russian roulette. So with all of this gloom and doom, I wanted to present a couple of scalable solutions that I see right now in the works that I think could potentially go further to protect New Yorkers as well as our global community from the risk of more future potential pandemics, as well as to address and reverse potentially catastrophic climate change, to give a bit of a hopeful message at the end of this Earth Day. And I think one of the big things that we can do is develop action plans with respect to food waste. These are things that I see already happening in New York City and in Brooklyn and across the boroughs. And I think right now are proving to be absolutely life-saving when vulnerable New Yorkers are finding themselves in need of more food security. And we're really realizing the value now more than ever of preserving and saving some of our food waste and diverting it to the people who need it most. Another thing that we might want to keep in mind for the environment, not just for the sake of all of our own food security, is that not all food waste is created equal. That meat and dairy tend to have these higher food footprints and these higher carbon footprints. So when we throw out a pork chop, it's equivalent to throwing out about a dozen plates of spaghetti because of all of the calories and food resources needed to grow that pig in order to produce that pork chop. And another thing I think we in New York can do is really tap and harness the rich and diverse plant-based food cultures that we have here in the city. Pretty much every major and even small restaurant that you go into is going to have plant-based option these days. You know, it's not just cold slabs of tofu anymore. These are some pictures of things that I've gotten to eat just this past several months before the shutdown happened. Everything from traditional French pastry to a Filipino kamayan feast served on banana leaves. We just have everything possible in the city, and it's so readily available to us to go out and try something new almost every day of our lives. But another thing that I think we can talk about when it doesn't just come to individuals, but our workplaces, is anytime that there's a meal served at our workplace or catered at a special event we're going to, we have the ability to change the default option. And I think that not only saves a lot of meat and dairy from being purchased, but it sends a signal to our greater culture that, the thing that you're not always going to go for is that roast beef sandwich, right? It could be a falafel wrap. And so there are some fantastic organizations like Default Veg who are supplying materials for anyone who works with a company who wants to make it easier from changing the default to having that first option be more plant-based and to having the plant-based options outweigh the meat options. This is not to say we're taking meat and dairy away from anyone, but I think just changing that first thing that people grab for could potentially massively reduce the amount of meat and dairy being purchased. Another thing, when we talk about scaling up from individuals to the institutions that we work for and that we pay tax dollars into, is divesting money from these risky industries. And this is already something that's getting a lot of steam when it comes to fossil fuels, right? Is the idea that in a future with climate change, fossil fuels shouldn't be earning us money. It should be things that put value back into the community, like technology and wind and solar, and not digging up fossil fuels up out of the ground to pollute our local communities and burn up our globe. And I think we can have these same conversations about the investments that we're making in meat and dairy companies, that we can actually shift the public and private dollars that we spend investing in these companies towards more sustainable food industries. And unfortunately, a lot of the stuff just isn't ready to happen at the federal level. I got interviewed by Business Insider last fall when Germany was purportedly considering taxing meat because of its disproportionate impact on the environment. And I just don't think that politically in this country, anywhere in our current polarized and heated and contentious environment, we're anywhere close to being able to pass a federal tax. But there are still things that I mentioned that we can do, including merely rolling back the government's overactive role in protecting industry, which could go a long way before any type of tax jumps into place. Because tax dollars go into protecting meat and dairy industries and subsidizing them and giving them cheap or to no cost insurance and smoothing out their risk, sometimes even buying back massive amounts of meat and dairy from farmers. These signals mitigate farm risk to such an extreme extent that farmers don't even have the chance to see the writing on the wall. And, you know, plant-based milks are becoming so popular, it's not even providing farmers the opportunity to pivot their industry towards these things like oat milk that might be more profitable in the future. And another thing that's incredibly relevant to us is we can all push to change local policies even more than they're being changed now. Mayor de Blasio mentioned in fall 2019 that meatless Mondays are going to be the case for all NYC schools starting last fall. And I think it was Brooklyn that piloted some of these programs.
Yep.
And, you know, he had this fantastic quote as well that, you know, I've never seen a mayor of a, you know, million-plus city make before, which is cutting back on meat a little will help improve New Yorkers' health. And I think you know something about that, Eric, and reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So drawing this direct connection between the meat we eat and the emissions in the atmosphere. And the One NYC plan also committed to reducing the city's red meat purchases by 50% and phasing out the purchasing of all processed meat for climate and health reasons. So not only are we preventing our, dampening down our risk from more future outbreaks, but we are improving our health and making ourselves more resilient to potential health complications in the future. And lastly, I think not only do we have that win-win, but we have some win-win-wins for public, private, and city government and nonprofits all to get together to protect our public health, prevent future disease outbreaks, and reduce our climate emissions all at the same time, which, you know, I've noticed you've had a hand in. So, you know, protecting New Yorkers' health, I think this has really got to be at the forefront of it. And by making more resilient, by having more resilient individuals, we can have more resilient communities as well. So really, that's kind of where I wanted to leave things off. And, you know, I hope that was a little bit of a helpful background about the science that I do and the research that we do, as well as an informative conversation for everyone listening about some more proactive things that they can do on Earth Day and how we can have a more resilient economy when we finally get that into gear.
And I think it's so important the way you laid it out. Oftentimes when people think about the enormity of the problem of dealing with the climate issue, they feel as though there's not much they can do. I think of the old movie or commercial that used to come on where a Native American was on the side of the road and they were asked, what can one man do? And there are things we can do individually that is a win-win, because not only are we going to protect Mother Earth, but we can protect our mother and fathers as well. And your presentation gives us simple examples to understand how not only how far our food is coming, but what type of food we are consuming. And that is so important.
Absolutely. You know, I like what you're saying about individuals needing to feel a little bit more empowered at these times, because already we've been feeling like, you know, what can I do when all my electricity, say, comes from a coal or natural gas-fired power plant? What can I do when I need to drive to get into work every day? And I think it's really, you know, we obviously need to move off fossil fuels, and we need a lot of government action behind that in order to make that move away from fossil fuels go even faster. But I think food is this one area where we can not only have a positive impact on our lives and in our entire family's lives and in our entire community's lives, we can also push for smart policies that push that needle forward for everyone at the same time. I think what's really fantastic about it is that it's personal empowerment and community empowerment at the same time.
It's so true. And during the times that we are in now with COVID-19, we are seeing how eager the everyday citizen would like to help. The mere thought that New York is being locked into their homes or sheltering in place, people would have thought it was unbelievable. But people will rise to the occasion if we give them an occasion to rise to. I truly thank you for this, and I look forward to working with you and others to continue to move this agenda forward.
Absolutely. And thank you for the work that you're doing today and doing for all of us to help keep us safer.
Thank you.
Bye, Eric.
Bye-bye.